The fluorescent lights of the Willowbrook Public Library hummed with their usual mechanical persistence, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional beige that made even the most vibrant book covers look faded. I adjusted my reading glasses for the 100th time today, the frames sliding down my nose as I bent over the stack of returned books that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. My lower back ached with the familiar throb that came from hours of bending, shelving, and carrying heavy volumes, while my sensible flats offered little cushioning against the unforgiving linoleum floors. 4 years. 4 years since I'd fled New York with nothing but a hastily packed suitcase and the terrifying certainty that I was carrying the child of a man whose true nature I'd discovered too late. 4 years of building a quiet life in this sleepy Oregon town, where the most exciting event was the annual Harvest Festival, and where nobody asked too many questions about a single mother who'd appeared one day with impeccable references and a desperate need for anonymity. The familiar weight of exhaustion settled over my shoulders as I wheeled the cart toward the children's section, my hand unconsciously moving to the small cross pendant that hung beneath my cardigan. A gift from my mother. It had become my touchstone in moments of stress, my fingers finding its smooth surface whenever anxiety crept up my spine like ice water. The scent of old paper and library binding glue filled my nostrils, mixing with the faint vanilla candle that Mrs. Henderson, our head librarian, burned at the front desk to mask the mustiness that seemed permanently embedded in the building's walls. "Emma," called Sarah Mitchell from the reference desk, her voice carrying the slight breathlessness that always accompanied her interactions with me. She was one of the few people in town who'd made genuine attempts at friendship, inviting me to book clubs and coffee dates that I politely declined with vague excuses about busy schedules and babysitter troubles. "The computer system is acting up again. Could you take a look when you have a moment?" I nodded, pushing the cart between the colorful displays of picture books and early readers. The children's section was my favorite part of the library, with its low shelves arranged to create cozy reading nooks and cheerful posters, encouraging young minds to explore new worlds. It reminded me why I'd chosen this profession, this life. Here, surrounded by stories of adventure and happy endings, I could almost forget the darkness I'd left behind. The soft chime of the front door announced another patron's arrival, followed by the measured click of expensive shoes against linoleum. I glanced up briefly, noting a tall figure in a dark coat consulting with Mrs. Henderson at the front desk, then returned my attention to the picture books that needed reshelving. Tourism season was beginning to wind down, but we still occasionally saw visitors passing through town, usually academics researching local history, or hikers exploring the nearby trails. My phone buzzed softly in my cardigan pocket, and I pulled it out to find a text from Grace, my babysitter and one of the few teenagers in town responsible enough to trust with my most precious secrets. "Kids are great. Eli wants to know if he can show Ella his new magic trick before you get home. Also, there's a man here asking about after-school programs." A chill ran down my spine, my fingers tightening involuntarily around the phone. The children rarely had visitors, especially not men inquiring about programs. I quickly typed back, "What kind of man? Did he give a name?" But before I could send the message, the sound of those expensive shoes had grown closer, accompanied by a voice that made my blood turn to ice. "Excuse me," the voice said, deep and controlled with that subtle hint of authority I'd once found so attractive. "I'm looking for information about your children's reading programs." I froze, my hand gripping the spine of a Dr. Seuss book so tightly that my knuckles went white. That voice. Rich baritone with the faintest trace of East Coast formality. The kind of careful diction that came from expensive private schools and boardroom meetings. The kind of voice that had whispered my name in luxury hotel rooms and promised me everything while hiding the truth about who he really was. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I turned around. Standing 3 feet away, impeccably dressed in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly salary, was Ethan Blackwood. 4 years had done nothing to diminish his commanding presence. If anything, he seemed more imposing than before. His dark hair now touched with distinguished silver at the temples, his storm gray eyes holding the same dangerous intelligence that had once made me feel like the most fascinating woman in the world. He looked exactly as I remembered, and absolutely nothing like the gentle accountant persona he'd maintained during our brief affair. This was the real Ethan Blackwood, the man whose name was whispered in certain circles with equal parts respect and fear. The man who commanded an empire built on shadows and violence, who could make problems disappear with a phone call or a subtle nod to one of his associates. "Hello, Emma," he said softly, his eyes taking in my simple cardigan, my sensible shoes, my carefully crafted facade of suburban normalcy. "You're looking well." My throat felt like sandpaper, my voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "What are you doing here?" A slight smile curved his lips, never reaching his eyes. "I think you know why I'm here." His gaze moved deliberately to the family photos on my desk, visible from where we stood, lingering on the images of two dark-haired children with their father's unmistakable gray eyes. "Beautiful children, Emma. They have my mother's chin." The picture book fell from my nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud on the carpeted floor. Around us, the library continued its quiet afternoon rhythm. Mrs. Henderson shuffled papers at the front desk, completely unaware that my carefully constructed world was crumbling beneath the weight of 4 years' worth of secrets, finally catching up with me. "How did you find us?" I managed to ask, though part of me already knew the answer. Ethan Blackwood had resources that most people could only imagine, connections that stretched across the country like an invisible web waiting to catch anyone foolish enough to believe they could simply disappear. "Does it matter?" he replied, bending to retrieve the fallen book with fluid grace. As he straightened, he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent that had lingered on my skin after our nights together. Before I knew what he was, before I understood the kind of man who could touch me so tenderly, and yet command such terrible power. "I'd like to meet them properly," he continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, despite the threat underlying every word. "My son and daughter. Our children, Emma." My hand moved instinctively to my pendant, clutching it like a lifeline. "They don't know about you. They think their father died before they were born." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or anger carefully controlled. "That's unfortunate. Children should know their heritage, don't you think? Know what they're heir to." The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. Heritage. What he meant was legacy, bloodline, succession. He wasn't here out of paternal love or curiosity. He was here because Ella and Eli were his heirs, the continuation of whatever dark kingdom he'd built in the shadows of legitimate business. The thought of my innocent, laughing children being drawn into that world made my stomach clench with nausea. "Emma?" Sarah's voice drifted over from the reference desk. "Is everything all right over there?" I forced a smile, though my face felt like it might crack from the effort. "Everything's fine. Just helping a patron with information about our programs." Ethan's smile widened, approving of my discretion. "Yes, I'm very interested in the programs you offer here. Perhaps we could discuss them somewhere more private? I have some specific questions about educational opportunities for gifted children." The words were innocent enough for anyone listening, but the underlying message was crystal clear. This conversation was far from over, and he wasn't leaving town without getting what he wanted. My children. His heirs. The future he'd never known he'd lost until recently. I glanced toward the small conference room we used for book club meetings, weighing my options. I could refuse, make a scene, call for help. But Ethan Blackwood wasn't the kind of man who could be dismissed by small-town authorities, and causing a disturbance would only draw attention to Ella and Eli. Whatever game we were about to play, it needed to happen away from innocent bystanders. "The conference room is available," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "We can discuss whatever programs might interest you." His nod was almost approving, as if I'd passed some kind of test. As I led him toward the small room with its oval table and motivational reading posters, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. The woman staring back looked older than her 32 years, with worry lines around her eyes and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to expect danger around every corner. 4 years of peace, of building something beautiful and normal for my children, was about to end. And despite the fear coursing through my veins, a treacherous part of my heart recognized the truth I'd tried so desperately to bury. Seeing Ethan again reminded me exactly why I'd fallen for him in the first place, and exactly why that made him more dangerous than ever. The conference room felt smaller with Ethan's presence filling it, his broad shoulders and commanding aura, making the cheerful reading posters seem almost childish in comparison. I closed the door behind us with hands that trembled slightly, the soft click echoing in the sudden silence like a judge's gavel sealing my fate. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the single window cast long shadows across the worn carpet, and I found myself calculating the distance to the door, the time it would take to reach it, the futility of such an attempt. "Please sit," Ethan said, though it wasn't really a request. He pulled out one of the chairs for me with old-world courtesy that felt like mockery given the circumstances. Everything about him radiated controlled power, from the way he adjusted his cufflinks to the careful placement of his hands on the table's surface. No nervous gestures, no wasted movement. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed, to having his wishes anticipated before he even voiced them. I remained standing, needing whatever small advantage height might give me, though we both knew it was purely psychological. "How long have you been watching us?" His smile was slight, almost fond, as if my defiance amused him. "Does it matter? What matters is that I'm here now, and I have some catching up to do with my children." He pulled out his phone, swiping to what appeared to be a photo gallery. 4 years old, I believe. Twins, obviously. Eli favors my side of the family more strongly, though Ella has my mother's eyes. The casual way he spoke about intimate details of my children's lives made my skin crawl. "You've been having us watched." "Of course." He set the phone on the table, the screen displaying a candid shot of Ella and Eli at the playground near our small house. They were laughing, chasing each other around the swing set while I sat on a nearby bench reading. The photo was high quality, taken with professional equipment from a distance that suggested telephoto lenses and careful surveillance. "Did you really think you could hide from me indefinitely, Emma? That I wouldn't eventually discover I had children?" My legs felt weak, and I sank into the chair he'd offered, my mind racing through the implications. How many photos did he have? How long had strangers been watching my babies, documenting their lives? Reporting back to this man who could destroy everything I'd built with a single phone call? "They're safe," he continued, noting my distress with what might have been genuine concern. "My people have explicit instructions regarding their welfare. No harm will come to them while they're under my protection." "Your protection?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "They don't need protection from anyone except you." Ethan's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, storm clouds gathering in those gray eyes. "You're naive if you believe that, Emma. The moment those children drew breath, they became targets. My enemies don't differentiate between legitimate heirs and unacknowledged ones." The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I'd spent 4 years believing I'd given Ella and Eli a normal life, free from the violence and danger that surrounded their father's world. But according to Ethan, simply being his children had painted targets on their backs from birth. "There was an incident 3 months ago," he continued, his voice taking on a business-like tone that somehow made the revelation more terrifying. "Vincent Caruso's organization attempted to gather information about my personal life. They came very close to discovering your location then." My blood turned to ice. Vincent Caruso was a name even civilians knew, whispered in news reports about organized crime investigations and unsolved murders. The fact that he'd been actively searching for us made me feel sick. "How close?" I whispered. Close enough that I had to redirect their attention elsewhere. The pause before redirect spoke volumes about what that might have entailed. They won't be a problem again, but there are others. There always will be, as long as my children exist unprotected. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white with tension. So this is how it's going to be? Threats disguised as protection? You'll use fear to force your way into their lives? Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same intensity I remembered from our brief time together 4 years ago. When he'd looked at me like that in hotel rooms and expensive restaurants, it had made me feel cherished, special. Now it felt like being examined by a predator deciding whether I was prey or potential ally. "Tell me about their lives," he said, abruptly changing direction. "What are they like? What do they enjoy?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I saw something almost vulnerable in his expression. Not the calculating crime boss, but perhaps a hint of the man who might genuinely want to know his children. "Eli loves magic tricks," I found myself saying before I could stop myself. "He practices for hours with this little plastic wand he got at a birthday party. And Ella, she reads constantly, already above grade level. She wants to be a veterinarian because she says animals need people to speak for them." Something softened in Ethan's features as I spoke, a warmth I hadn't expected. "Intelligent children. Good. Intelligence is crucial in our family." The possessive pronoun wasn't lost on me. "What about their health? Any issues I should be aware of?" "They're perfectly healthy," I said defensively, then immediately regretted revealing even that much. Every piece of information I gave him was another thread in the web he was weaving around us. "Excellent. I've arranged for Dr. Harrison to evaluate them next week. He's a pediatric specialist who handles all the children in my organization's families." My heart stopped. "You've arranged what?" "Children's wellness checks are important, Emma. Surely you agree." His tone was reasonable, but the underlying steel was unmistakable. "Dr. Harrison is discreet and thorough. He'll also be able to provide any necessary documentation for the transition." "What transition?" But even as I asked, I suspected I already knew. Ethan's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it before standing with fluid grace. "I'm afraid our initial conversation will have to be brief. I have other appointments this afternoon." He straightened his coat, every movement precise and controlled. "But don't worry, Emma. We'll have plenty of time to discuss the children's future in detail." "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, standing as well, my voice stronger than I felt. "And neither are Ella and Eli." His smile was patient, almost pitying. "I haven't asked you to go anywhere, yet." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Oh, and Emma, you should know that I've taken the liberty of purchasing the house next to yours. The elderly couple who lived there were quite reasonable about relocating once I explained how much I valued neighborhood tranquility." The room spun around me. Mrs. Patterson and her husband had been our neighbors since I'd moved to town, quiet retirees who occasionally babysat when Grace wasn't available. They'd mentioned nothing about moving, certainly nothing about selling to anyone. "That's impossible," they would have told me. "People rarely discuss their private business arrangements," Ethan interrupted smoothly, "especially when those arrangements include generous compensation for discretion." He opened the door, then looked back at me one final time. "I'll be in town for the foreseeable future, Emma. I think it's time I got to know my children properly, don't you?" With that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the conference room with the lingering scent of his cologne and the terrible certainty that my carefully constructed life was already unraveling. Through the window, I watched him walk to a sleek black sedan where a driver waited with the engine running. Professional, efficient, completely out of place in our small town, where the most expensive car in the lot was usually the mayor's 5-year-old Honda. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Grace. The man left, but he said to tell you he looks forward to meeting you soon. He seemed really nice. The kids are asking if he was here about a play date. A play date. If only it were that simple. If only Ethan Blackwood were just another parent looking to arrange social activities for his children, instead of a dangerous man reclaiming heirs he'd never known he'd lost. I sank back into the chair, my legs no longer able to support me, as the full weight of the situation crashed down. He wasn't just watching us anymore. He'd moved into our neighborhood, arranged medical appointments for children he had no legal right to, and demonstrated with terrifying efficiency exactly how powerless I was to stop him. 4 years of safety, of building a normal life for Ella and Eli, had been an illusion. We'd never truly escaped Ethan Blackwood's reach. We'd simply been living in a bubble of ignorance until he decided to pop it. And the most terrifying part was that a traitorous voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was right about the protection. Maybe hiding from the world hadn't kept my children safe after all. It had just kept them vulnerable in ways I'd never imagined. Would you like me to continue with part 3? A continuer plotted narrative structure for pivotal negotiation scene. The user wants me to continue with part 3. I need to follow the structure outlined in the instructions. The drive home passed in a haze of mounting panic, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my aging Honda so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. Every turn seemed to take forever, every red light an eternity, where my mind conjured increasingly terrifying scenarios. What would I find when I reached our small house on Maple Street? Would Ethan be there waiting, making himself comfortable in my living room while my children innocently showed him their latest artwork? Would Grace even realize the danger she'd unknowingly led into our lives? The familiar sight of our modest 2-story home should have brought relief, but instead, it filled me with dread. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. Grace's beat-up Volkswagen in the driveway, Eli's bicycle abandoned on the front lawn, Ella's chalk drawings still decorating the sidewalk in rainbow colors. Normal, peaceful, innocent. Everything Ethan's world was not. I sat in the car for a moment, gathering courage I didn't feel, my mind inevitably drifting back to those 3 weeks in New York that had changed everything. 4 years hadn't dimmed the memories, hadn't made them any less vivid or any less painful. I'd been 28, working as a freelance accountant for a small firm that occasionally took on corporate clients. The assignment had seemed routine: audit the books for Blackwood Industries, a successful import-export company with offices in Manhattan's financial district. Ethan had been charming from our first meeting, apologizing for the late hours the work required, sending expensive lunches to my temporary office, showing genuine interest in my observations about his company's financial structure. He'd been everything I'd thought I wanted in a man. Sophisticated, successful, attentive in ways that made me feel special rather than ordinary. When he'd asked me to dinner after my second week on the assignment, I'd said yes without hesitation. When that dinner led to drinks at his private club, then to his penthouse overlooking Central Park, I'd convinced myself I was living a fairy tale. 3 weeks of intensity that felt like 3 months. Expensive restaurants where maitre d's knew him by name, Broadway shows from private boxes, weekend trips to his house in the Hamptons, where we'd made love on Egyptian cotton sheets, while the ocean whispered outside floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd made me feel like I was the only woman in the world, like he'd been waiting his entire life to find me. The night everything changed, I'd surprised him at his office with takeout from his favorite Italian restaurant, planning to work late together and maybe steal a few private moments between spreadsheets. His assistant had already left, the building eerily quiet as I'd made my way to his corner office with its panoramic city views. The conversation I'd overheard through his partially open door had frozen my blood. Ethan's voice, calm and controlled as always, discussing territory disputes and payment collections. The casual mention of a man named Rodriguez who'd been handled for failing to meet his obligations. the methodical planning of what sounded unmistakably like violence, discussed with the same tone he used to review quarterly projections. I'd stood paralyzed in that hallway, takeout containers growing cold in my hands, as the man I'd fallen in love with revealed himself to be someone I'd never truly known. When his meeting ended, and he'd found me there, pale and shaking, he'd known immediately that I'd heard too much. "Emma." His voice had been gentle, concerned, the same tone he'd used when comforting me through work stress or family worries. "Come inside, let me explain." But there had been no explanation that could erase what I'd heard, no rationalization that could make it acceptable. I'd dropped the food and run, taking nothing from his apartment but my purse and the terrible knowledge that I'd been sharing my bed with a man whose business involved broken bones and disappeared problems. The pregnancy test had come back positive 2 weeks later, long after I'd fled New York and found refuge with a college friend in Oregon. By then, I'd already decided that Ethan Blackwood could never know about the children I carried. Whatever love I'd felt for him had curdled into something that tasted like fear and betrayal. The sound of the front door opening jolted me back to the present. Grace emerged, her teenage face bright with the kind of excitement that made my stomach clench with dread. "Mrs. Collins, you'll never guess what happened today." This really distinguished man came by asking about after-school programs, and when I mentioned Ella and Eli, he seemed so interested in meeting them. He said he might have some educational opportunities that could benefit gifted children. I forced a smile as I climbed out of the car, my legs still unsteady from the afternoon's revelations. "What exactly did he say, Grace?" "Oh, just questions about their interests and abilities. He was really impressed when I told him about Eli's magic shows and Ella's reading level." She gathered her backpack, oblivious to my growing horror. "He left his card and said he'd love to arrange a proper meeting with you to discuss possibilities. Isn't that exciting?" I took the business card she handed me with fingers that trembled slightly. Heavy stock paper, expensive printing, embossed letters that spelled out E. Blackwood, educational consultant, with a phone number but no business address. Clean, professional, completely misleading. "Where are the children now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Inside doing homework. Ella's practicing her spelling words, and Eli's working on that math worksheet that's been giving him trouble." Grace shouldered her bag, already heading toward her car. "Oh, and Mrs. Collins? He seemed like such a nice man. Very polite, great with kids." Eli was showing him that card trick with the disappearing coin, and the man acted like it was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. My heart clenched at the image of my son, my innocent, trusting son, performing for the man whose blood ran through his veins, the man who could destroy our lives with a single decision. After Grace left, I stood on my front porch for a moment, looking at the house next door. The Pattersons' modest ranch home looked exactly the same as always, but now I noticed details that had escaped my attention before. The for sale sign was gone from the yard. When had that happened? The windows that had always been open during the day were now covered with blinds. Even the flower garden Mrs. Patterson had tended so carefully looked somehow abandoned, despite being recently watered. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The children are delightful, Emma. We should discuss their future soon. Are you free for dinner tomorrow evening? I've made reservations at Romano's for 7 p.m. Come alone." Romano's was the nicest restaurant in town, the kind of place where anniversary dinners and business deals happened over white tablecloths and wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The kind of place where Ethan Blackwood would blend in perfectly while I felt completely out of my element. I typed back, "I can't leave the children." His response came immediately. "Already arranged. Mrs. Chen from the library will babysit. She's been thoroughly vetted and comes highly recommended." The casual efficiency with which he'd organized my life, made arrangements I hadn't agreed to, left me breathless with a mixture of rage and helplessness. Mrs. Chen was indeed trustworthy. She'd helped with the children before during library events. But the fact that Ethan had already contacted her, already arranged my schedule, demonstrated just how thoroughly he'd researched our lives. Another text. Emma, I'm not your enemy. I'm their father, and I want what's best for them. Give me a chance to prove that. I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to refuse, to take the children and run as far as my modest savings would carry us. But another part, the part that remembered how his face had softened when I'd described Ella and Eli, wondered if perhaps there was some middle ground to be found. The front door burst open, and Eli came running out, his dark hair tousled and his gray eyes bright with excitement. Mama, Grace said a man came to visit today who knows about magic. Did you meet him? Is he really going to teach me new tricks? Behind him, Ella appeared in the doorway, more cautious as always, her identical gray eyes thoughtful. Grace said he asked lots of questions about us. Why would a stranger want to know about us, Mama? Looking at them, my beautiful, innocent children, who had no idea their lives were about to change forever, I made my decision. If Ethan Blackwood wanted to discuss their future, then we would discuss it. But it would be on my terms, with my conditions, and with the clear understanding that I would fight him with everything I had to protect the life we'd built. I typed my response. Fine. Tomorrow at 7. But we need to establish some ground rules. His reply was immediate. Looking forward to it. And Emma, thank you for giving me this chance. As I shepherded the children inside for dinner, homework, and the bedtime routine that had remained blissfully unchanged for 4 years, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap of my own making. But perhaps, if I was very careful and very lucky, I could negotiate terms that would keep my children safe while satisfying whatever paternal instincts had brought Ethan Blackwood to our door. The alternative, constant running, looking over our shoulders, never knowing when he might appear again, was no way to raise children. At least this way, I could face the threat head-on and try to control how it affected their lives. Tomorrow night would determine whether that was naivety or wisdom. The reflection staring back at me from my bedroom mirror looked like a stranger. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue dress I'd worn to exactly 2 events in the past 4 years, both library fundraisers where looking professional mattered more than fashion. The fabric was good quality, but obviously off the rack, the kind of careful purchase that prioritized durability over style. Paired with my only decent heels and the small pearl earrings my mother had given me for college graduation, it was the best armor I could assemble for a battle I wasn't sure how to fight. Mrs. Chen had arrived precisely at 6:30, her gentle efficiency with the children both comforting and unsettling. She'd come prepared with a bag of activities and seemed to know exactly which cartoons Ella and Eli preferred, which bedtime stories they'd want her to read. The thoroughness of Ethan's research into our lives continued to astound and terrify me in equal measure. "You look beautiful, Mama," Ella had said, as I'd kissed them goodbye, her small hands smoothing the skirt of my dress with unconscious maternal gestures that made my heart ache. "Are you going somewhere special?" "Just dinner with an old friend," I'd managed, hating the lie but unwilling to burden them with truths they were too young to understand. Romanos occupied the ground floor of the town's only historic building, a converted Victorian mansion that had been carefully restored to showcase original crown molding and hardwood floors, while accommodating modern dining expectations. On the few occasions I'd walked past during evening hours, I'd glimpsed intimate lighting and couples sharing wine at tables draped in crisp white linens. It was the kind of place that existed in a different economic stratosphere from my usual haunts, where entree prices started at what I typically spent on groceries for a week. The maitre d' recognized my name immediately, his professional smile warming as he led me through the main dining room toward a private alcove in the back. The table was set for 2 with crystal stemware that caught the candlelight like prisms, silver that bore the patina of quality, china so delicate it seemed translucent. Fresh orchids served as centerpieces, their exotic beauty making the roses I occasionally splurged on for our kitchen table seem quaint by comparison. Ethan rose as I approached. and for a moment I was struck again by how perfectly he belonged in these surroundings. The charcoal suit he wore looked hand-tailored, probably costing more than my monthly salary, but he carried it with the unconscious ease of someone who'd never known anything else. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, every detail contributing to an aura of power and prosperity that made other diners glance his way with curiosity and respect. "Emma." He moved to pull out my chair, his hand briefly touching my shoulder as I sat. The contact sent an unwelcome shiver through me, muscle memory from a time when his touch had been welcome, cherished, craved. "You look lovely." "Thank you." I accepted the compliment stiffly, my hands folding in my lap to hide their trembling. The wine he poured without asking was something I didn't recognize, deep red, and probably worth more than I wanted to consider. "I can't stay long. Mrs. Chen needs to be home by 10. His smile suggested he knew exactly how long Mrs. Chen could stay, and that it was significantly later than 10 o'clock. "Of course. We should order quickly then." He signaled the waiter with a subtle gesture that brought immediate attention. "The Seabass is excellent here, and I believe they have a special preparation tonight that you might enjoy." The casual way he ordered for both of us, anticipating my preferences with uncanny accuracy, reminded me uncomfortably of our time together in New York. He'd always seemed to know what I wanted before I knew it myself, whether it was food, wine, or experiences I'd never imagined having access to. At 28, I'd found his certainty romantic, sophisticated. At 32, it felt like manipulation. "How did you really find us?" I asked, once the waiter had retreated, my voice low enough to avoid carrying to neighboring tables. The truth this time. Ethan swirled his wine thoughtfully, studying the liquid as if it contained answers to profound questions. "Vincent Caruso's people were closer than I initially indicated. They'd traced you to Portland, then started working their way through surrounding communities. It was only a matter of time before they found you." My blood chilled at the confirmation that my worst fears were true. "How long do we have before they try again?" "They won't." His voice carried absolute certainty. "Vincent and I reached an understanding last week regarding territorial boundaries and family protection protocols. He's agreed to redirect his interests elsewhere." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what he was really telling me. Vincent Caruso had been neutralized, either through negotiation backed by credible threats or through more permanent means. Either way, the danger he'd represented was gone, eliminated by the man sitting across from me with the same ease he'd used to order our dinner. "And the next threat?" I pressed. "There will be others, won't there?" Ethan nodded slowly, his expression growing serious. "There always are, Emma. It's the nature of the business I inherited from my father, the legacy I've built upon. But threats can be managed, neutralized, redirected. What matters is having the resources and connections to stay ahead of them." Our appetizers arrived, delicate arrangements that looked more like art than food. I picked at the expertly prepared scallops, my appetite diminished by the weight of our conversation and the implications of his words. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked finally, setting down my fork and meeting his gaze directly. "Because I won't expose Ella and Eli to violence, no matter what protection you claim to offer." "I'm proposing a partnership," he said, leaning forward slightly. "A carefully structured arrangement that acknowledges the reality of our situation while protecting what matters most to both of us." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder, placing it on the table between us with the same care he'd shown with everything else tonight. "I've purchased a house here in town, large enough for all of us, secure enough to ensure safety, comfortable enough to provide the kind of life our children deserve." I stared at the folder without touching it, knowing that whatever documents it contained would represent the end of the independence I'd fought so hard to build. "You want us to move in with you. I want our children to have stability security, and opportunities that extend beyond this small town. His voice remained calm, reasonable, but I could hear the steel beneath. Excellent schools, cultural experiences, travel, connections that will serve them well regardless of what paths they choose in life. And what would I be in this arrangement? The question came out more bitter than I'd intended. Your kept woman? The mother of your children who's expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you offer? Something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or genuine surprise at my characterization. You would be my partner, Emma. In every sense that matters. The woman I should have married 4 years ago if circumstances had been different. The words hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I dared cross. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to imagine that the feelings we'd shared in New York had been real, despite the lies that surrounded them. But another part, the part that had kept us safe for 4 years, whispered warnings about trusting a man whose profession required him to be an expert at deception. I need guarantees, I said finally. Written agreements about the children's safety, their education, their exposure to your business affairs. Ethan's smile was approving, as if I'd passed some kind of test. Already prepared. He opened the folder, revealing documents that had clearly been drafted by expensive legal counsel. Full custody arrangements that protect their interests, trust funds for their education and future needs, and explicit protections regarding their involvement in family business until they reach majority age. I scanned the papers with growing amazement. Every concern I might have raised had been anticipated. Every protection I could have demanded already included. The trust funds alone represented more money than I could earn in several lifetimes, while the custody arrangements gave me significant authority over decisions affecting the children's daily lives. This is very generous, I admitted, though suspicion still clouded my thoughts. What do you get out of it? My family, he said simply. The chance to know my children, to be part of their lives, to ensure they have every advantage I can provide. He paused, his gaze growing more intense. And perhaps eventually, the chance to rebuild what we lost 4 years ago. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, reminding me of moments in New York when his carefully maintained control had slipped just enough to reveal the man beneath the public facade. Those glimpses had been what I'd fallen in love with originally, the suggestion that behind all his power and sophistication was someone who needed connection as much as he commanded respect. The house is ready for immediate occupancy, he continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. Mrs. Patterson spoke very highly of the neighborhood and the school district. I believe Ella and Eli would find the transition relatively seamless. Of course he'd spoken with Mrs. Patterson. Probably learned everything she knew about our daily routines, our friends, our habits. The thought should have angered me, but instead I felt a grudging admiration for his thoroughness. Whatever else Ethan Blackwood might be, he was clearly a man who planned carefully and executed those plans with precision. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Children asleep, all well here, take your time. Even my babysitter was part of his orchestration. Her message perfectly timed to remind me that he'd thought of everything, anticipated every concern, removed every obstacle to his proposal. I need time to think, I said, though we both knew my options were limited. He'd made it clear that remaining in our current situation wasn't safe, and running again would only delay the inevitable, while placing the children at greater risk. Of course. Ethan signaled for the check, his movements as controlled and elegant as everything else about him. But don't take too long, Emma. Other interested parties won't wait indefinitely for me to secure my family's safety. The implied threat was delivered with the same gentle tone he'd used to compliment my appearance, making it all the more effective. As he walked me to my car, his hand at the small of my back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive, I realized that the negotiation was over. All that remained was the formality of my surrender. The moving truck arrived at 7 a.m, exactly 3 days after my dinner with Ethan. I hadn't formally agreed to his proposal, hadn't signed any documents, hadn't even spoken the words yes aloud. But somehow, professional movers were carefully packing our modest belongings, while Ella and Eli watched from the porch swing, their eyes wide with excitement about the adventure Mama had promised them. The new house has a library, I'd told them, which was true according to the floor plans Ethan had provided, and a big backyard where Eli can practice his magic tricks. Also true, though I'd omitted mentioning the discreet security features that surrounded the property like an invisible fortress. Mrs. Chen stood beside me in the doorway, her weathered hands clasped together as she watched the systematic dismantling of our life. "Mr. Blackwood seems like a very thoughtful man," she said carefully. "The children will have opportunities here they might not have had otherwise." I wondered what exactly Ethan had told her about our arrangement, how he had explained his sudden appearance in our lives and his equally sudden integration into our family structure. Mrs. Chen was old enough and wise enough to recognize when she was seeing only part of a larger picture. But she was also kind enough not to ask questions that might put me in an uncomfortable position. "Yes," I agreed. Because what else could I say? That I was trading our hard-won independence for protection from threats I still didn't fully understand. That I was allowing my children to be drawn into a world where their father's business associates settled disputes with violence rather than lawsuits. The house Ethan had purchased sat on 5 acres at the end of Willowbrook's most exclusive street, a sprawling contemporary structure that managed to look both impressive and welcoming. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of professionally landscaped gardens, while the interior featured open-concept living spaces that flowed seamlessly into one another. The kitchen alone was larger than our entire previous living room, equipped with appliances that probably cost more than my annual salary. "Mama, look!" Eli's voice echoed through the high ceilings as he discovered the media room with its enormous screen and theater seating. "It's like having our own movie theater." Ella was more drawn to the library, running her small fingers along shelves that held both classic literature and contemporary works, many of them first editions that belonged in museums rather than private homes. "Can I really read any of these?" she asked, her voice hushed with reverence. "Of course," Ethan replied, appearing in the doorway with the silent grace that seemed characteristic of his movements. He wore casual clothes today, khakis and a navy sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, but somehow still managed to project an aura of command. Though some of them might be a bit advanced for now. We'll work up to those. The casual assumption that he would be part of their educational journey, that we would be making decisions about their development, should have irritated me. Instead, I found myself noting how naturally he interacted with them, how Eli gravitated toward him, with the unconscious trust that children reserve for adults who genuinely cared about their well-being. "Mrs. Collins," one of the movers approached with a clipboard. "Where would you like the items from the master bedroom?" I hesitated, suddenly realizing I had no idea where I was supposed to sleep in this arrangement. Ethan had shown me through the house the previous day, pointing out the children's rooms with their built-in desks and reading nooks, but he'd been deliberately vague about the sleeping arrangements for the adults. "The master suite is at the end of the hall," Ethan said smoothly, appearing at my elbow with perfect timing. "Emma, perhaps you could show them which items go where." The master suite was stunning, with a king-sized bed that dominated the space and French doors leading to a private balcony overlooking the gardens. His clothes already hung in the walk-in closet, expensive suits and casual wear arranged with military precision. A smaller section had been cleared for my belongings, the space allocation making clear that this was his domain where I was being offered accommodation. "We need to discuss boundaries," I said once the movers had deposited my suitcases and moved on to other rooms. "The children's expectations about us." Ethan's smile was patient, almost indulgent. "What boundaries did you have in mind? Separate bedrooms would be a start. At least until we figure out how this arrangement is going to work long-term." He moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where Ella and Eli were exploring an elaborate playground that hadn't been there during my tour the day before. The guest suite is certainly available if that's what you prefer, though you should know that several of my business associates will be visiting over the next few weeks. It might raise questions if we're obviously not sharing living space. Of course there would be business associates. Of course our personal arrangements would be subject to the requirements of his professional image. I was beginning to understand that every aspect of this new life would be carefully orchestrated to serve his larger purposes, with my comfort and preferences being secondary considerations at best. My phone rang, interrupting my growing frustration. The number wasn't one I recognized, but something about the timing made me answer despite my usual caution about unknown callers. "Is this Emma Collins?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, but with an underlying edge that made my skin crawl. "Who is this?" I moved away from the window, instinctively seeking privacy for a conversation that felt immediately threatening. "Someone who knew you in New York. Someone who's very interested in your current living situation." A pause, pregnant with menace. "Particularly your new relationship with Ethan Blackwood." My blood turned to ice. Through the window, I could see Ella and Eli playing on the swings, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. They looked so innocent, so unaware that their new life might have already attracted exactly the kind of attention I'd spent 4 years trying to avoid. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though we both knew the denial was pointless. "Of course you do. The question is whether you understand what you've gotten yourself into." The voice took on an almost conversational tone. "Ethan Blackwood's women tend to have short lifespans, Emma, especially the ones who know too much about his business operations." Before I could respond, the phone was plucked from my hand with startling speed. Ethan had moved across the room in complete silence, his expression transforming into something cold and dangerous as he brought the device to his ear. "This is Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made generals nervous. There was a pause as he listened, then, "Mr. Torino, how unexpected. I trust you're calling to offer congratulations on my recent family reunion." Another pause, longer this time. I watched Ethan's face, noting the subtle tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible change in his posture that suggested a predator preparing to strike. "I see," he said finally. "Well, let me clarify something for you, Anthony. Emma and our children are under my direct protection now. Any attempt to contact them again will be considered a hostile act against my family." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And you know how I respond to threats against my family." He ended the call and handed the phone back to me, his expression already returning to its usual controlled calm. But I'd seen the glimpse of the man beneath the sophisticated exterior, the one who'd built an empire through calculated violence and absolute ruthlessness. "Who was that?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. "Anthony Torino. He works for interests that would prefer to see me distracted by personal concerns rather than focused on business expansion." Ethan moved to the French doors, his gaze finding the children in the garden below. "He won't be calling again." The finality in his voice suggested that Anthony Torino's ability to make phone calls might be permanently impaired in the very near future. Part of me was horrified by the implication, but another part felt a fierce satisfaction that someone who'd threatened my children would face consequences for that mistake. "This is what our life is going to be like, isn't it?" I said, more statement than question. "Constant threats, constant vigilance, constant reminders that we're living in your world now." Ethan turned from the window, his gray eyes holding mine with startling intensity. "This is what your life has always been like, Emma. You just didn't know it before. The difference is that now you have protection, resources, and the security that comes with being part of my family." His family. Not just under his protection, not just recipients of his generosity, but actual family with all the privileges and obligations that entailed. Looking out at Ella and Eli playing in their new backyard, surrounded by security measures they couldn't see and protected by power they couldn't comprehend, I realized that Ethan was right. We belonged to him now, completely and irrevocably. And despite every rational objection I might raise, despite every fear about what that belonging might cost us, I was beginning to understand that it might be the only thing standing between my children and dangers I was only just beginning to comprehend. 3 weeks into our new life, I'd almost begun to believe that perhaps Ethan had been right about the protection he offered. The children had adapted to their new routines with the resilience that made me both proud and heartbroken. Proud of their flexibility, heartbroken that they'd needed to develop it so young. Ella threw herself into the extensive library with the passion of a scholar discovering lost treasures, while Eli spent hours perfecting increasingly elaborate magic tricks in the expansive backyard under the indulgent eyes of Ethan's security team. The men who watched over us had become familiar faces rather than threatening presences. Marcus, the head of security, actually smiled when Eli performed his disappearing coin trick for the 5th time that day. David, who monitored the perimeter, had helped Ella rescue an injured bird and builded a small recovery habitat in the garden. They were professional, discreet, and surprisingly gentle with children who saw them as friendly adults rather than armed guardians. Ethan himself had proven to be a devoted father in ways that both surprised and unsettled me. He attended their bedtime stories religiously, helped with homework with infinite patience, and showed genuine delight in their accomplishments. When Ella had read her first chapter book cover to cover, he'd celebrated by taking us all to dinner at the nicest family restaurant in the neighboring city. When Eli had finally mastered the card trick he'd been struggling with, Ethan had arranged for a professional magician to give him private lessons. It was Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. I'd been working in the home office Ethan had set up for me, managing correspondence for his legitimate business interests, while the children played in the garden under Marcus's watchful eye. The work was engaging, challenging in ways that reminded me why I'd loved accounting before fear had driven me into hiding. Numbers didn't lie. Patterns revealed themselves to careful analysis, and there was satisfaction in bringing order to complex financial structures. My phone rang just as I was finishing a quarterly report. Ethan's name appearing on the screen with the familiar flutter of awareness that still caught me off guard. 3 weeks of living in close quarters hadn't diminished the physical attraction that had drawn us together originally. If anything, seeing him with Ella and Eli had added new layers to feelings I was still trying to process. Emma. His voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before, controlled but unmistakably tense. Where are the children? I glanced out the window automatically, expecting to see them on the playground equipment. Instead, I saw Marcus pacing near the garden shed, his phone pressed to his ear, and his face grim with concern. David was nowhere to be seen, and the yard that should have echoed with childish laughter was ominously quiet. They should be outside, I said, already moving toward the French doors that led to the patio. Marcus is here, but I don't see them. Get inside the house immediately, Ethan ordered, his voice cutting through my rising panic like a blade. Lock the doors and wait for my call. Don't answer for anyone else. The line went dead before I could ask the questions that were crowding my throat. I rushed outside, calling for Ella and Eli while my heart hammered against my ribs with increasing violence. Marcus appeared from behind the shed, his expression confirming my worst fears before he spoke a single word. Mrs. Collins, we need to get you inside immediately, he said, his hand already guiding me toward the house with gentle but irresistible pressure. Mr. Blackwood is handling the situation. What situation? My voice came out higher than intended, edged with the hysteria I was fighting to control. Where are my children? Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Eli was taken from the back garden approximately 15 minutes ago. Ella is safe. She was inside using the bathroom when it happened. We have men searching the perimeter, and Mr. Blackwood has activated all available resources. The world tilted sideways, my vision graying at the edges as the implications crashed over me. Someone had taken my son. My beautiful, trusting boy who performed magic tricks for anyone willing to watch, who still believed the world was fundamentally good and safe. The child whose gray eyes held all of Ethan's intelligence combined with an innocence that could shatter my heart with a single smile. "Who?" I managed to whisper. "Who took him?" "We're working to determine that," Marcus replied, his professional calm doing nothing to ease the terror clawing at my chest. "Mr. Blackwood will have answers soon." I found Ella in the library, curled in the reading chair she'd claimed as her own, her small body shaking with sobs that tore through me like physical wounds. She launched herself into my arms the moment she saw me, her words tumbling out between gasps for air. I was in the bathroom, and when I came back, Eli was gone, and there was a man I didn't know talking to Marcus, and everyone was running around, and they won't tell me where Eli is, and I'm scared, Mama. I'm so scared. I held her against my chest, stroking her dark hair while my own tears fell silently. All the protection Ethan had promised, all the security measures and professional guards, and still someone had managed to take my child. The safe haven I'd been cautiously beginning to trust had revealed itself to be as fragile as every other illusion of safety I'd ever constructed. My phone rang again. Ethan's name on the screen, but when I answered, the voice that spoke wasn't his. "Mrs. Collins? This is Anthony Torino. I believe we spoke briefly a few weeks ago." The voice was smooth, conversational, as if he were calling to discuss dinner plans rather than holding my child hostage. "I have something that belongs to you." "Where is he?" The words came out as a growl, all pretense of civility stripped away by maternal fury that burned hotter than fear. "If you hurt him." "He's perfectly safe for now," Torino interrupted. "Charming boy. Very polite, very trusting. He's been showing me his magic tricks while we wait for his father to arrive. Father. Not stepfather. Not mother's boyfriend. But father." Even Eli's kidnapper recognized the truth that I'd been fighting to deny. "What do you want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be something I couldn't give. Ethan Blackwood's withdrawal from certain business interests that conflict with my own. Nothing too complicated. Just a signed agreement transferring territory rights and a promise to redirect his expansion plans. Torino paused, and I could hear background noise that might have been traffic. "He has 2 hours to consider my proposal. After that, I'm afraid young Eli might disappear as permanently as his father's previous problems." The call ended, leaving me staring at the phone while Ella clung to me with desperate strength. 2 hours. Someone was giving Ethan Blackwood 2 hours to choose between his business empire and his son's life, as if there could be any question about which mattered more. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression grim but determined. "Mrs. Collins, Mr. Blackwood will be here in 20 minutes. He wanted me to assure you that everything possible is being done to bring Eli home safely." "And if it's not enough?" I asked, voicing the fear that was eating me alive from the inside. "What if this time he can't fix it?" Marcus's smile was razor sharp, carrying absolute confidence in his employer's capabilities. "Ma'am, you haven't seen what Mr. Blackwood is truly capable of when his family is threatened. Anthony Torino has made the last mistake of his career. When Ethan arrived, he brought with him an army. Not literally, but close enough. Black SUVs filled with men whose movements spoke of military training and whose eyes held the cold calculation of professional soldiers. He swept into the house like a force of nature, gathering Ella and me into an embrace that felt like stepping inside a fortress. "He's going to be fine," he murmured against my hair, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I promise you, Emma, I will bring our son home. Our son. Not your son, or the boy, but our son." The possessive pronoun wrapped around my heart like armor, offering the first genuine comfort I'd felt since discovering Eli was missing. 90 minutes later, it was over. Ethan returned with Eli sleeping peacefully in his arms, exhausted from his adventure but completely unharmed. The men who'd taken him were gone, permanently, according to the look in Ethan's eyes when I'd asked about consequences. Anthony Torino would never threaten another child again. That night, as we sat together in the master bedroom, with both children sleeping between us despite their own perfectly appointed rooms, I finally understood what Ethan had been trying to tell me all along. This wasn't about control or possession or even paternal rights. This was about family in the most fundamental sense, the willingness to destroy anything that threatened the people you loved most. "I'm sorry," I whispered in the darkness, "for fighting this, for trying to keep them from you, for believing we could be safe without you." His arm tightened around me, his lips pressing against my temple in a gesture that felt like a promise. "You have nothing to apologize for. You were protecting them the only way you knew how." His voice grew quieter, more intense. "But now you know there's a better way. Now you know that together, we're stronger than anything that tries to hurt our family. Our family." The words no longer felt like a threat or a trap, but like coming home after a long journey through dangerous territory. As I drifted toward sleep, surrounded by the 3 people who mattered most in the world, I realized that sometimes surrender wasn't defeat. Sometimes it was simply the wisdom to recognize when you'd found something worth keeping. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new reminders of the complex world we now inhabited. But tonight, we were complete. Tonight, we were safe. And tonight, for the first time in 4 years, I wasn't afraid of what morning might bring, because whatever it was, we would face it together.